Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Continuing on with our series about making wood turning tools, today we're going to make a roughing gouge. This is by far the most difficult tool we'll make in this series of videos, but if you're an experienced bladesmith, I don't think you'll have a lot of trouble with it. I'm going to use some fairly specialized tools, but you don't have to have them. With a little elbow grease and some improvisation, you can still make this tool. Now, if you haven't watched my other videos, I'd encourage you to watch them first because we'll be incorporating some lessons from earlier videos. So, what is a roughing gouge? A roughing gouge is a U-shaped chisel or turning tool which is used for hogging off materials that you turn on a lathe. We'll be starting with a piece of simple high carbon steel known as 1095. I bought this piece of 1.5 by 3/16 by 72 inch bar from Admiral Steel, which sells knife steel online in small quantities. Then I cut off a piece about 10 inches long. Basically, we'll make it by mashing the steel into a sort of U shape. So, in order to do this, we'll need to have a die to push it down into. So we'll start by making that die. Now, if I were making these on a production basis, I'd obviously build a tool and die set for each radius of gouge, and then I'd drop forge the tools on my hydraulic forge press. They'd all be made out of high quality steel and all that sort of thing. But since this is a one-off tool, I'm going kind of low-tech. This part of it is something that anybody can do at home. You don't need a whole bunch of expensive steel. You don't need really fancy equipment. I'm a really big believer that there's no point in making super complicated tooling if you're not going to be repeating a project very often. So in this case, I'm making a die that's literally disposable. I'll make it out of an extremely dense and hard wood Purple Heart. If you've never used Purple Heart, I recommend that you pick some up and fool around with it. It's lurid purple, kind of goofy looking stuff, but it's very, very strong and, just kind of an interesting wood to add to your palette. Anyway, so I'll use a bandsaw to cut out a half cylinder of about 1.25 inches in diameter. Now I'll grind a very rough tang into the blank. Grinding the tang now will make forging easier. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just want something that will make that U shape easier to forge into the steel. I'll heat up the tool blank in my forge. As in some of the other videos in this series, you can heat it with an acetylene torch or maybe even a small MAP gas rig, so you don't necessarily have to have a propane forge like this. Now, using a trusty assistant to hold a 5/8 inch mild steel bar as a tool, I'll carefully position the blank on the die, the tool on the blank, then whack it into a U shape in the die. It'll take a couple of passes and some tinkering, but eventually you can get a pretty nice uniform U shape.
Alright, let go. Okay, just lift it. Lift it.
After that, I'll stick the blank back in the forge, turn off the forge, and give it a rough anneal. Next, I'll grind the blade to shape. I'll use the flat platen to true up the exterior surfaces and to square the top surface. Then I'll I'll use this very small radius wheel to polish and shape the interior. Bader grinders call this a BJ tip. Why? I do not know. Anyway, all of this can be done by hand with sandpaper if you don't have a belt grinder. It'll take a lot of effort, but it's totally doable. You can put wet or dry sandpaper around a 5/8 inch dowel, lubricate it with oil, and just sand away until you get the finish you want. Like I said, lots of elbow grease required, but it is possible. Believe me, when I started my knife making journey, I did an enormous amount of things in a really, really laborious way with nothing but hand tools. If you're willing to spend the time, you can make just about anything. Now, this is the first time I've made this type of tool, so I goofed up a little and thinned the edges more than I'd like, but I know through the magic of hindsight that this won't wreck the tool. In fact, this tool will actually work quite well. Once everything's all trued up, I'll heat treat it. You've probably already seen some of the videos in this series. We've already showed how to harden 1095 tool steel in the first video in the series, so I won't go into a ton of detail. Heat it up to cherry red, about 1500 degrees, then quench it in water. It passes the file test, so we know it's nice and hard. Now I'll temper it twice for an hour each time at 400 degrees. I'm using my heat treating oven, but your kitchen oven will work just fine. Once we're done with the heat treat, I'll give it a final polish and then sharpen it. I'm sharpening it to roughly a 45-degree angle, going up to a 30 micron belt for the final edge. This makes it wicked sharp. But you don't have to go quite that far. Just use whatever your standard grinding techniques are for turning tools. And now it's time for the handle. For this project, I'm making a slightly larger handle than I have on the other tools in this series, closer to 14 inches. I happen to have a nice piece of hickory that's the perfect size. Now, in one of my earlier videos, I talked about how I like to use cool looking woods and so forth, and you know, hickory is quite boring to look at, so it violates my general approach here. But look, this is the classic American tool handle wood. It makes for a fantastic tool handle, so I'm not going to apologize. Here I am mixing 2-part epoxy and then slathering it on all possible surfaces. Putting on the ferrule. Then inserting the tang. I'm filling the excess space between the handle and the hole with a couple of scrap wood wedges. Now we clean up the squeeze out, and that's all she wrote. So we've done a couple of 1095 projects so far and done the heat treating for them. Wasn't that hard, but is it possible to find an even easier steel to heat treat? Absolutely. We'll find out about that in our next video, in which we'll make a smaller spindle gouge. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my website, waltersorrellsblades.com, where you can find more of my work. You'll also find plenty more videos there that you can't find on YouTube with very, very detailed information about all aspects of Japanese blade making. Also, like me on Facebook at Walter Sorrells Blades.